Great. Good evening, everybody. Welcome once again to our Tuesday night opportunity to hear Rabbi Simon give us another insight into one of our famous sages tonight, the Maharal of Prague. Rabbi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Neil, and thank you to everyone who has participated in this series over the weeks, or even if you're here for the first time, Bruchim Habayim. Our subject tonight, as we've just heard, is Maharal, the man behind the legend. You can see at the top of the page, if you look at your screen, Rabbi Yehuda Lowy or Liva of Prague, who is known as the Maharal, Morena Harav Liva. Maharal is one of the most well-known, one of the most famous and I would say venerated personalities in all the rabbinic world, probably in all of rabbinic history. And people know the Maharal partly because of the legend of the Golem. In fact, probably some people know the Golem better than they know the Maharal himself. And we find that Maharal, as I said, is a very popular rabbinic personality, popular in the sense that he's a figure of folklore, folk legend. He is actually a legend among the Czechoslovakian people as well. He's a local hero. In fact, in I think 1917, if my memory serves me, the capital city, meaning Prague itself, commissioned a statue of the Maharal to be positioned opposite City Hall. It's the only city in the world which has a rabbi outside of City Hall, including in Israel. It's the only, we don't find that. Actually, when the Nazis came to town, that statue never would have been tolerated. And in anticipation of the Nazi invasion, it was sequestered away. They hauled it away and hid it in a warehouse. And when the war was over, they recovered it and restored it to its position where you can visit it. Now, in fact, since we're talking about it, I'll just scroll down here on the second page. You can see here a picture of that famous statue itself. Again, since we're looking at it, I'll just point out that, of course, the rabbi is Maharal. And you can see here a figure of a girl who is extending her hand. And according to the legend, the Maharal his time had come. The angel of death had been authorized to claim his soul, but because he was always so busy learning and in avodah, it wasn't possible for the angel of death to disrupt him until a girl approached him with a rose, and he made a bracha on the aroma of the rose. And as he smelled the rose, the Malach HaMaves, the angel of death, was lurking inside and sort of entered his nostrils and took his soul, according to the legend. Maharal and his grave are popular tourist attractions today, and we visited Prague. Probably you visited Prague as well. We were there years ago. One can hardly move for all the German tourists in the great old Jewish cemetery in Prague, of which the Maharal is the greatest celebrity there. The word golem, or I should say the word robot, derives from the Czech word for golem. And in fact, even Frankenstein's monster by Mary Shelley, or some say Percy Bysshe Shelley actually, was based on the legend of the Golem of the Maharal. So since we're talking all about the Golem, let's just explore that question first. I said the man behind the legend. So the legend of the Golem is certainly very well known. The basis in our tradition for the concept of a Golem is substantial. The word golem appears in Tehillim. You can find it chapter 139, verse 16, if you want to look it up afterwards. Galmi ro'e necha. That is to say, Adam or King David says, you saw me, you Hashem saw me in my unfinished state. The word golem means something which is unfinished. It's mentioned in the Mishnah as well. In the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos, we have Shiva Dvarim b'golem v'Shiva b'chacham. There's 7 features that are characteristic of a golem. and 7 opposite ones of a chacham, like interrupting a person while he speaks. That's one of them. It's mentioned elsewhere in the Mishnah as well. Gal mechlei cheres. So the word golem is something or a person who is unfinished, unrefined, incomplete. But not only that, the Talmud in Sanhedrin mentions Rava bara Gavra, that Rava, the sage Rava, created a person, bara Gavra. And the Rashi says, Al Yidei Sefer Yitzira B'tziruf Osios, through employing the mystical text known as Sefer Yitzira, the book of formation, and combining letters in mystical and esoteric ways. So he managed to create a person. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Chaim Volozhin, the famous disciple of the Vilna Gaon, reports, and in his introduction to one of the books of the Vilna Gaon, that his master, the Vilna Gaon, also made a golem at one time, and there was a sort of heavenly indicator that this is not something to be favored. And I think he was about 13 years old at the time, the Gra, according to this report of Rav Chaim Volozhin. So the idea of a golem is found in our tradition in a number of places. In fact, we can even mention this tshuva right here. If you're looking at your screen, so this is a tshuva of Chacham Tzvi. Chacham Tzvi was the father of Rav Yaakov Emden. He was Tzvi ben Yaakov Ashkenazi. He was a Rav in Amsterdam and elsewhere. And he writes in his responsa, here it is, Shela Sadi Gimel, Nistapakti Adam Hanotzar Al Yidei Sefer Yitzira. I'm just trying to get my cursor here. Adam Hanotzar Al Yidei Sefer Yitzira, a person who was fashioned through Sefer Yitzira, as they say in Sanhedrin, Rava bara Gavra, V'chene Idu, and they say the same thing, by the way, about my grandfather. He says, Eliyahu Av based in Tegillah Kadosha, Chelm. Now you might say, wow, what a distinction to be the chief rabbi of Chelm. It seems that the Chelm was actually a city of some distinction. How it became associated with the folklore of simpletons, I'm not quite sure. But in any case, you see, Chacham Tzvi is proud of his grandfather, who was the Av based in the Chelm, and they said about him that he also made a golem. So he wants to know, Chacham Tzvi ponders the question, Mimit starif la'asara ledvarim hatzichim asara, kagum kadish v'kedusha. Can you count him in a minyan? By the way, the Mishnah Berurah refers to this Chacham Tzvi, this tshuva Chacham Tzvi as well. So he asks the question, and as you can see, writes a short tshuva, a couple of paragraphs, and he concludes that no, you may not count him in a minyan, because he establishes that he's not mitzvah in a minyan because of certain things. We don't need to go into it. This substantiates the idea of a golem, but I would suggest that this responsum tends to call into question the legend about the Maharal and the golem, because we know from elsewhere that the Chacham Tzvi greatly respected Maharal. You can see his dates here. He lived from 1658 to 1718. Now, that's about a century after Maharal. Maharal died in 1609. And we know from elsewhere that he greatly respected Maharal, was aware of the greatness of the Maharal. And if it had been true that the Maharal also made a golem, he probably would have mentioned it in this tshuva, rather than just mentioning the Gemara and Sanhedrin and a legend or tradition about his grandfather. He would have said Maharal as well. So this would tend to question that tradition. We actually have no historical evidence for a golem in the days of the Maharal. Moreover, according to the legend, the golem was created in order to defend the Jews against blood libels and pogroms and that sort of thing. Actually, in the days of the Maharal in Prague, it was a time of relative security and prosperity for the Jewish community, although we'll have a bit more to say about that shortly. And actually, there's no historical evidence that a golem was especially necessary at that particular time. Also, one of his great Talmidim was Rav David Gans. Actually, if you just look here in this paragraph on the left-hand side, mentions his most prominent Talmud was Rabbi Yom Tov Lipman Halevi Heller, the author of the Tosfos Yom Tov, was the most famous Talmud of the Maharao. Another important Talmud was Rav David Gans, who was a historian, also a Talmud Chacham. He was the Talmud of the Ramah as well as Maharao. He wrote a book called Tzemach David, Sefer Tzemach David. It's a history book. And he writes about Maharal, and he was a Talmud of Maharal. He doesn't mention anything about the Golem. The Chida in Shem HaGadolim, again, praises Maharal, writes about the greatness of the Maharal. He mentions nothing about a Golem, and he's not especially fastidious about distinguishing fact from legend as well, Chida. So again, if there was such a tradition, he would have mentioned it if he was aware of it, and it's hard to believe that he would not be aware of it. The evidence suggests that the association of the Maharal and the Golem derives from somewhere after the first quarter of the 18th century, and long after the death of the Maharal. I don't want to say more about it, but we can, let's just say that the historical evidence to support the legend of the Golem is thin, to put it charitably. But that's not to say, excuse me, that the greatness of the Maharal is in any way diminished thereby. Let's talk about Maharal, the man. He was a popularist, he was an activist, he was an outspoken defender of the downtrodden and the common man. And that is the first interesting observation I'd like to make. Although we remember him as a Kabbalist, as a philosopher, as a great thinker, a profound thinker, an influential thinker, we'll learn more about that as we go along. In his own lifetime, he was so highly regarded because he was an activist. He was an ish hama'as. He was a person of accomplishment who was in touch with the needs of the community and of the common man as well. He was a defender of the downtrodden, and that's part of why he is regarded even to this day as a folk hero to the Czech people. Even they say that even at the time of his birth, he averted a blood libel, according to the legend. Excuse me, although we don't know really when he was born. If you look here, it says Posen. He was born in Posen in Poland in 1525. He was definitely born 1525 at the latest. He may well have been born as early as 1512. There's evidence that he was born even in 1512, in which case he would have lived an exceptionally long life. You see, he lived until 1609. But in any case, whatever the year was, according to the legend, his mother went into labor with him on the Seder night, and his father had to dash out late at night on the Seder night through the quiet streets of the Prague ghetto to summon a midwife. And as he did, as he was running through the streets, he saw that there was some evidence of disturbance in the synagogue. And he, after he got the midwife, or possibly he went inside and he saw that a bottle of wine had been tampered with. And he examined it. It turns out it was blood. And it was evident that a blood libel was foiled that night, because Pesach, as we know, is Easter time, is associated with the blood libel. And according to the legend, the Maharal foiled, even by his birth, this blood libel. Of course, the matter was averted because the blood was discarded. A bottle of wine was put in its place, and when the authorities marched into the shul the next day, saying that we know that you've sequestered Christian blood, of course they were disproven. And this was because late at night, when all the Jews of Prague were at home with the Seder, the father of the Maharal was rushing around looking for a midwife. Okay, just by way of a legend. Here's another legend for us, part of which is definitely true, and again, it may have been possibly aggrandized with the retelling. He was a young prodigy, and at a young age, as yet a teenager, probably a young teenager, he was sought out by the wealthy man of Prague, of Posen, I suppose. Actually, I said Prague. He wasn't born in Prague, so my story about the blood libel wouldn't have been in Prague, it would have been in Posen. But in any case, he was sought out by a wealthy man for a son-in-law, and the girl's name was Pero. The father was called Reich Schmelke, the wealthy Shmuel, Reich Schmelke, and Maharal was engaged to marry his daughter Pero. So they set a date for the wedding. Unfortunately, between the engagement and the wedding date, however long that was, the father lost his wealth. And he had promised the young uh, budding scholar that he would support him in a respectable way to continue his Torah studies. But unfortunately, he was no longer able to do so. And the family offered to the Maharal, the opportunity to be released from his commitment, to break the engagement, because the father, prospective father-in-law, was no longer able to fulfill his side of the arrangement, and the Maharal declined to do so. But they had no money for the wedding or for anything. So Perel opened up a bakery, and according to the story that she was baking bread to sell, and on one occasion a soldier rode into the bakery, and with his spear he speared a couple of loaves of bread, and he was going to rush off with it without paying. She ran after him and she pleaded with him. She said, this is the difference between profit and loss for the day. Please, you must pay me. Don't steal these. So the soldier said, I would pay you, but I've got no money. But I will come back and pay you. So she said, will you give me some kind of collateral? So he took a scarf or something like that, some kind of a blanket, and he gave it to her as collateral. He said, if I don't come back within however many days, you can keep this. So she took it. Of course, he never returned. When she opened it up, she found it was lined with gold. And with that, they had the money to proceed with the wedding, etc. I don't normally indulge in all of these legends, but the Maharal, although he's definitely a historical figure about whom we know quite a lot historically, as we shall see, but he's also a figure of imagination. It was captivated the imagination of the Jewish people. By the way, the Maharal would never sign on a arrangement to terminate a shidduch. If a couple had made a commitment to get married, and they were to make tanaim, which they used to do very commonly in those days, and then the shidduch were to go sour, and the parties or one party would like to terminate it. So this is considered quite a serious matter, and the Beis Din would get involved. Maharal never would sign, never would personally participate in such an event. He felt that the failure to keep one's word in such an arrangement is such a grave matter. He did not want to personally be involved in it. Other members of the Beis Din perhaps would do so. At we don't know exactly the age because we don't know when he was born with reliably, but in 1553 he became the Rav of Nikolsburg. From 1553 to 1573 for 20 years. From Nikolsburg he went to Prague, where he became a Rosh Yeshiva. But from Prague, he then went back to Posen, then back to Prague, and happened maybe three times. He went between the two towns. So he was a highly regarded personality as an educator, as a kind of charismatic figure, and he is always associated with Prague. And of course, as we know, he's buried in Prague. But in actuality, he spent much of his life in other places, in Nikolsburg, in Posen, and elsewhere. He had friendly relations with Rudolf II, who was the emperor in Prague. Rudolf was enlightened. He was interested in philosophy. He was naturally interested in theology, but he was also interested in alchemy, the idea of the sort of ancient quest for some means of turning iron into gold, which is a kind of mythical quest that people have pursued for since antiquity. And Maharal, because of his reputation as a Kabbalist, as a mystic, as a philosopher, as a sage, as a theologian, as a profound and creative thinker, as someone who had access to the ancient traditions and the wisdom of yore. So Rudolf wanted to meet him, and apparently they did have a meeting in the palace. We have some details about that, in which Maharal discussed with him the possibilities of alchemy. Whether Maharal himself believed in it or thought such a thing could be accomplished, I'm not sure. But in 1592, he had a personal appointment, a personal consultation in the royal palace. In fact, there is a road leading up to the palace in Prague called Golden Lane, which you can visit ad hayom hazeh. Although he's remembered today as a mystic, in his lifetime, as I said, he was a practical person. He is quoted in halachic sources from time to time. He did not write extensively on commentaries on the Talmud or Shulchan Aruch or halachic matters. We have a few responsa from his pen, but he did not write extensively or did not publish extensively on that subject. However, he is cited by the other great authorities from time to time, always with great reverence. The Taz quotes him in a certain place in Hilchos Nida about a certain halacha, which we don't need to dwell on, but that's something quite practical. I don't want to go into that right now. He also was na'ed doresh v'na'eh mekayem, meaning that he taught and he preached and he urged admirable or exemplary behavior, and he exemplified it as well. He didn't just talk the talk, he walked the walk as well. He stood up, as I mentioned, for the common man. He was a courageous and outspoken critic of the erroneous, what he regards the erroneous system of education. And for this, one doesn't have to be a scholar of Maharal. I want to just scroll down here and please take a moment to look at this fascinating passage from the writings of the Maharal. Actually, I'll just scroll up a moment and we can look here where you have in this little paragraph, brief paragraph about his life. It says that in 1592, accepted the position of rabbi in Posen, returned to Prague in 1598 to serve as chief rabbi. He was a prolific writer, and his works include Tiferes Yisrael, Be'er Hagola, etc. You can see them over here. The author of this little paragraph fails to mention perhaps his most widely studied commentary, though, and that is called Gur Aryeh. I hope you've heard of it, because Rabbi Yoshua Hartman, who now lives in Northwest London, has been here for probably 10 or 15 years now, has written extensively on Maharao. He has published critical editions of most of the writings of Maharao, but the first thing he did was on Gur Aryeh, which is the Maharal's super commentary on Rashi. Super commentary meaning a commentary upon a commentary. If you look over here, Gur Aryeh al Perish Rashi, and this is the reference, Dvarim Vav Zayin, Vishinantam Levanecha, a very well-known pasuk because we say it in the Shema every day, twice a day. Vishinantam Levanecha. So I said you don't have to be a scholar. I mean, you don't have to necessarily buy the philosophical works of the Maharal. If you just have access to Gur Aryeh, which is widely available, his commentary on Rashi, take a look at this fascinating passage, what he has to say about the educational system, in which he excoriates the prevalent system of educating children. The Torah says, teach it diligently to your children. So he writes a bit about the right way to educate a child, and then he says, but nowadays that's not how they do it. The fools in these countries, their approach is the opposite of this. And they teach the child a little bit from each parsha, then they interrupt. The next week they do the next parsha. Then the next week, every week they do Parshas HaShavua. What does the boy learn? The first few verses or the first part of each parsha. By the time the year ends, he doesn't know what the Torah says. All he knows is a little bit about the first verses of each parsha. What about everything in between? Until the next year, they do the same thing again. And they think, well, this educational system is working because the boy knows more and more. But it's only because he becomes more mature year by year. But he doesn't have an organized understanding of the Torah. Take a look a bit further. He says, by the time the year is over, he forgot what he learned at the beginning. Year by year, they do the same thing. And then when he's done learning Mikra, because now they want to take him on to Torah Sheba'al Peh, so he's finished in his education with learning the written Torah, he says he won't take anything with him. His departure will be like his arrival. He knows very little from the Torah because of the corrupt system, the inane system of teaching. Also El Hagemara Miyad. Then there are some who say, okay, now he's not ready for Gemara. He says, Yitzhaft Seif Hanar B'Kol Dvarim Bilvad. The boy will chirp just like a bird. He's just mimicking what he hears. Utumanas Hapshat Lo Yada. He won't understand even the outline of the simple understanding. He won't understand anything because he's just parroting what he hears because he's not really ready for Gemara yet at that young age. He won't come away with as much as a fox who walks through a field which has been plowed. But rather like a fly will take away from a marble a countertop, which is to say, zilch. But they're not done with him yet, because then as he gets a bit older, and his intellect matures a bit more. Then right away they start to teach him Tosfos. It says, he'll think he understands it. Anyway, he says a little bit further, if only he had the main part, don't worry about the Tosfos. Of course, it's a pun. He means Tosfos on the Talmud he doesn't understand. Best to let him focus on the main part and don't go for the frills. And so he goes on, and he says, then they go to Pilpul Shel Hevel, great erudite, analyses of the Talmud, comparing one passage to another in the way of the, mature scholars. Lasot the Pilpul Shel Hevel. This is, vain and futile intellectual exercises. And he goes on until he says, then he's going to write a ksuba for a wife because he's getting married. Az hushlach mishamayim aretz. Then he's hurled from the heaven down to the earth. He'll feel as if he's been dreaming kol yamav all of his days until then, meaning his whole education comes to almost nothing. And he says that he will be left, Yifrosh min ha-Torah legamre, he'll leave the Torah entirely. Lo yisav yadom l'ma, he'll take nothing with him. Lo mikra, lo mishnah, not a scripture, and not mishnah, and not Talmud, and not derech eretz. Halo kol adam shivakesh kavod kono v'doresh ha-Torah. Anyone who values the honor of his creator and who seeks out the Torah, Ra'ui sheyihya davar libo al zeh. His heart will pain him because of this. Okay, I've done this passage, which we haven't normally been doing such long Hebrew passages in our studies together in this series, but I want to illustrate from this passage how practical is this man. He's so down to earth. He excoriates his contemporaries. He's courageous in his denunciation of the prevalent educational system. This is the writing and the approach of a practical leader. So I'm not in any way diminishing or taking away from his greatness as a Kabbalist and as a philosopher. I'm just observing that he joined together the intellectual gifts and the profound, creative, brilliant mind with the practicalities as well. And I say again, this is really why Maharal has always been so well remembered, because of his courageous Torah leadership. Now, whether his advice was taken in terms of education, I'm not quite sure. Perhaps it was in a way. But actually, anyone who's been through the yeshiva system or who has boys in the yeshiva system can probably recognize that this criticism still rings true to a significant extent. Okay, he denounces what was called nadlerism at the time. It was a kind of nasty habit that people had of spreading defamatory rumors about a family, to say that a certain family, either they are of impure birth, or they have hidden heresy or Christological tendencies, this sort of thing, that would defame the entire family. It would make it difficult to get a shidduch for generations sometimes. It was known as nadlerism, and he forcefully denounced that. He founded the yeshiva. I mentioned already some of his talmidim. Most of their names we don't know, but he did definitely have some famous Talmudim, we mentioned them already. I keep talking about the practicalities of it. Excuse me. Maharal was able to found the yeshiva, to teach so many students, to courageously stand up for the common man, because he had the support of a very influential, powerful, affluent, generous patron. His name was Mordechai Mizel. Mordechai Mizel was in Prague what I don't know what we might say. Bill Gates is in where does he live? Seattle. He was extremely wealthy, extremely philanthropic, and he became the right-hand man of the Maharal. He was fabulously wealthy, as I keep saying, extravagant generosity. He supported the yeshiva. He built the shul for the Maharal, even though his official shul was an off-night shul, but he built another shul for the Maharal. He paid for the sewage system in the ghetto. He paid to have the entire ghetto of Prague paved. When a nearby town burnt down in a fire, he paid to have the town rebuilt. We're talking about someone of extreme wealth and generosity. He had no children, sadly, Mordechai Mizel. And when he was approaching old age, he drew up a will in which he designated that his vast wealth should go to a whole range of charitable causes. And the Maharal himself was to be the executor. His will, the original will, still exists with the signature of the Maharal. I've seen that will. You can probably see it as well if you go to the Jewish Museum in Prague. I'm assuming it's still on display. The tragic thing is that when Mordechai Mizel died, so the crown seized the entirety of his assets, even though he had the will notarized, etc. But they said, rich Jew dies, he's got no children, so the crown will inherit him. And so it was. So this was in 1602, according to my notes. So it just illustrates how, although it was a time of relative peace and prosperity, the Jews were still, as we've been saying, confined primarily to a ghetto, the ghetto of Prague, and the rule of law when it comes to Jews was not necessarily reliable. But my point here is that Maharao was an activist. He cultivated the support and won the support and admiration of wealthy and influential Balabatim that helped enable him to accomplish many of his the great things for which he was known. In terms of his philosophy, we'll learn more about it shortly, but I would just observe that Maharal expects much of the tzaddik, of the Talmud Chacham, of the one who is the exemplar of the Jewish people. He's very demanding of him. He expects him to be completely devoted to the Jewish people and to set an exalted standard of ethical probity and perfection. If he's a Torah scholar, his behavior, his interaction with other people has to be of a beyond reproach. And in this way, he anticipates and probably influences the Hasidic movement that also greatly emphasized the importance of the tzaddik, of the Rebbe, of the one who is the leader of the flock and the one who will inspire and speak out in support and in defense of the common man. So Maharal, as I say, himself was such a personality. Let's talk about his writings. He has been described as having a unitary philosophy. Maharal wrote extensively. The collected writings of the Maharal, I think, occupy about, I've got it set in the room, occupies about 15 to 20 volumes. In Rabbi Hartman's version, it's even more because he has very extensive footnotes. So he wrote extensively, voluminously even. Having said that, he returns to many, many themes time and again. So that's actually part of the work of Rabbi Hartman, is to provide the cross-references. Frequently, Maharal will deal with a subject partly in one place, furthermore in another place, return to it in a third place, elaborate further in another place. And in order to really understand his message, one has to review or have mastery over the full breadth of the writings of Maharal. So in a way, he's not like that well organized, in which he deals with a certain subject in a certain book and another subject in a different book. Many of the subjects he takes up appear in different forms. It has to be said there is a certain amount of repetition as well for that reason. His style is unique. Kabbalistic concepts, but philosophical language. Rav Hutner said about Maharal that it's Chachma nistara b'lashon nigla. The wisdom is the hidden wisdom, the esoteric wisdom, but the language is the language of philosophy. It's the language of a straightforward Hebrew. It's not like the writings of the Ari or Reb Chaim Vital. We spoke about the Ari last week, 2 weeks ago actually, where the language itself is very difficult to penetrate. Maharal is not that way. His use of Hebrew is quite fluent. Nevertheless, the way that he uses many terms requires quite a lot of effort or training to appreciate. It's not like something which you can just pick up and read a page or a chapter and sort of appreciate it in that way. You need to be introduced. It takes quite a lot of effort. I once remarked that Maharal is one of those sources that is oft quoted and little studied. Other than those who really delve into it thoroughly, Maharal is quoted frequently, but not that often does a person crack open one of his books and read it cover to cover. I'm not blowing my own trumpet, but I once did read one of his books, one of his fascinating books, Netzach Yisrael, cover to cover. I did it because I took a course in graduate school in Maharao, and part of what I had to do was to read one of his books in its entirety and to write an essay on it, which I did. And that actually has given me an understanding of the style of the Maharao, which I would not have otherwise had, merely dipping into it from time to time or following up on the references that we may come across in our studies. So, but nevertheless, as I say, the Maharal is more frequently quoted than studied in detail. What's his approach? So he has an emphasis on uncovering the deeper meaning of the teachings of Chazal, especially the Agadot, the narrative, the legends, the midrashic passages, studying them carefully, meticulously, creatively, looking for the nuances, approaching them with great reverence and great respect, and yet seeking to find the deeper meaning. The Maharal is possibly the foremost expositor of the Agadot of the Talmud and the Medrash as well in this fashion. So he has the highest respect for the sages, but he does not insist on a literal understanding of the teaching of the sages. And this is part of the popularity and the beauty of Maharal, and I think why he's so relevant today as well. In an age where people maybe are prone not so much to skepticism, skeptics we've had since the time immemorial, but let's say a greater respect for a greater inclination to regard science as a source of truth than an ancient rabbinic text. If we can reconcile the two, if we can interpret the rabbinic text in a way that does not do violence to the tenets of science or rational thought, then we have a satisfying insight, and the Maharal offers us that. It's worth mentioning that the Maharal was a traditionalist in the sense that he, among many others, excoriated the bête noire of the rabbinic fraternity of the 16th century. This is Rabbi Azariah Derasi, known as Azariah Min Ha'adumim, and he wrote a book called Me'orei Naim. He was an Italian rabbi who was much too modern for his contemporaries, and he challenged the wisdom of the rabbis and rejected it in many cases. And Maharal is quick to call him out. I mentioned, for those who recall, when we spoke about, Rav Moshe Alshech a few weeks ago, we said Rav Moshe Alshech wrote a tshuva against Azariah Derasi at the behest of Rabbi Yosef Karo of the Beis Yosef. So this Azariah Derasi, he was sort of the scholar they loved to hate. And Maharal again was at the forefront of criticizing Azariah Derasi for his willingness, Derasi's willingness, to reject the teaching of the sages or to refute them. So Maharal venerates the sages, but he interprets them and he finds a deeper meaning within them, which, as I say, has a contemporary resonance in many cases. I'll just mention a few of the topics that he returns to again and again: the relationship of man and God, physical and spiritual, Zachar v'Nekeva, male and female, Chomer and Tsura, matter and form, the Galus and Geula, exile and redemption. He elaborates extensively on the significance of the land of Israel, Mashiach, comforting the Jews in their exile, hope, confidence, and pride. These are themes which he develops in a very compelling way. And again, there's a contemporary, probably a timeless, but a contemporary resonance for that as well. He writes quite a lot about the land of Israel, about the importance of the land of Israel, about the Jewish people who belong in the land of Israel, to the extent that when the Jews are in exile, the entire world is out of kilter. And he says that the chaos, whether politically or in other ways, we might even suggest the meteorological chaos that from time to time afflicts the world, global warming or climate change. For that matter, there was a mini ice age a few hundred years ago as well, and this sort of thing. Maharal would, he does suggest that the world is out of sync because the Jews have been exiled from their land. With this in mind, it's not surprising that Maharal is very popular with religious Zionists. He was, very popular, especially with the Rav Kook. I read once that a Talmud of Rav Kook had testified that the books of Maharal never departed from the desk of Rav Kook, that he frequently studied the writings of Maharal. And when we talk about the influences, so I would say that religious Zionism has been influenced by the teachings of the Maharal. Maharal remains very popular until this day in those circles, but not only those circles. He has influenced the Gra, the Vilna Gaon, the Hasidim, particularly the intellectual strains within the Hasidic world, like the Maggid of Koznitz, Pshischa, also Chabad, Sfas Emes. These are all sources that draw on the Maharal either explicitly, or one can recognize his fingerprints, the echo of his thought in their writings. Closer to our own times, well, I just want to make an interesting observation. The writings of Maharal, I mentioned that they've been reprinted recently. You can buy it, well, more recently in Rabbi Hartman's edition, but the classic edition that's been available for the last, so for as long as I can remember, actually was printed in London in the early 1960s. But what's interesting is that the writings of the Maharal were not reprinted that frequently until quite recently. Netzach Yisrael, which is one of his most important works, that's the one that I studied. But it's one of his, not the only one, but that's one I studied cover to cover, about Galus and Geula, Mashiach, and the reasons for the exile. Netzach Yisrael means the eternity of Israel, was reprinted 7 times in 400 years. So actually, it was not among the most, let's say, widely studied works in Torah literature. It's more recently, in the last 100 years or so, maybe 100 years plus, say 150 years, that the writings of the Maharal have become more and more popular, more and more widely accessed. as I've mentioned, some of the later Hasidic thinkers, such as Sfas Emes and others, closer to our own times, the Baalei Musar as well, such as Rav Dessler. In fact, Netzach Yisrael was printed in 1960 in London by Aryeh Carmel. Some of you may even remember Aryeh Carmel. I met him once. Aryeh Carmel was a Talmid of Rav Dessler. Aryeh Carmel was a surveyor, actually. He was a bit of a rabbi, though. He was a big Talmid Chacham. He worked as a surveyor. He made Aliyah towards the latter part of his life. So that book was printed in he was a Talmud of Rav Dessler, Michtami Eliyahu. Also Rav Hutner, Rav Yitzchak Hutner. And Rav Hutner probably was influenced in this regard by Rav Kook, because Rav Hutner also was a Talmud of Rav Kook at one time. Also Rav Gedalia Sher, the Rosh Yeshiva of Torah Vodaas. Gedalia Shur. His son-in-law lives here in Golders Green. Perhaps I won't mention, but anyway, he does. He's a big Talmid Chacham, but I won't mention that. But last of the influences of Maharal that I want to mention is the great Rav Moshe Shapiro. He spoke. He used to come to London regularly. Spoke many times in London. Spoke in Hendon. Don't know whether he spoke in Israel. Probably never spoke on Zoom, but he definitely has many Talmidim, many followers in London, of which I include myself in that number, among many, many others as well, all over the world. Moshe Shapiro, I would say, is probably the greatest in the yeshiva world, the greatest contemporary advocate and popularizer of the Maharal. I mentioned his influence on Zionism, the importance of the land of Israel, the importance of nationalism, messianic vision, and also we mentioned his intellectual approach to the Midrashim, which would on the surface appear fantastic or even fanciful. I've got a few minutes left. We've rushed a bit because I do want to have the chance still to look at some of these short selections as well from his writings. So take a look with me here on the left. This is an excerpt from Gvuras Hashem about Matzah. On the night of Pesach, the children of Israel were freed from bondage in a supernatural way, a deliverance completely devoid of any material aspect. It is to commemorate this supernatural aspect that they were commanded to eat the matzah. So Maharal explains the symbolism of matzah, unleavened bread, in terms of the nature of the redemption from Egypt, bread in its most simple form, devoid of any extraneous ingredients. Spiritual freedom means basic simplicity, total independence from material wants. In the same vein, scripture relates that they left Egypt in a rush. This indicates that their liberation was instantaneous without passage of time. What occurred was timeless and metaphysical. It was beyond time. It was an event that encapsulates the very essence of the Jewish survival, which transcends the limitations of time. I'm elaborating slightly. It says that's why on Pesach we eat matzah, because matzah is bread that's baked almost in a heartbeat. Everyone knows that matzah has to be 18 minutes, but if you've ever watched matzah actually being baked, from the time it goes into the oven till the time it comes out of the oven is maybe 1 minute. It bakes very quickly. The 18 minutes is the total amount of time from when the water first touches the fire. And even that is normally accomplished in a much less than 18 minutes. So matzah, says Maharal, symbolizes that which transcends the limitations of time because it happens without time. What occurred was timeless and metaphysical. This timelessness is inherent in the matzah, a bread that comes into being virtually in an instant without undergoing the time-consuming process of leavening. But this is an example, one of the famous thoughts of Maharal about matzah. Here's another excerpt, also about time, motion, and matter. But perhaps we'll do this one here on the right instead. Rabbi Yulin ben Betzalel, known as Maharal Prague, and this first paragraph characterizes his writings. It's worth reading. His writings reveal a mastery of classical Jewish knowledge in rabbinics, philosophy, and Kabbalah, but he also showed extensive familiarity with current secular knowledge. The thrust of his writings was a call to cultivate inwardness in the religious life, to forge out of knowledge and ritual practice a ladder by which to ascend to God, which I think is a very eloquent and apt way to characterize the objective, the sort of the urging that the Maharal seeks to inspire his readers with. In exposition of these ideas, he often referred to the teachings of the Kabbalah, but he had the art of transcending the esoteric linguistic symbols of the Kabbalists, meaning Ari and Chaim Vital, Ramak, and others, and distilled from them lucid ideational content, charged with a noble spiritual sensibility. It is this which made him a figure of transition from the esotericism of the Kabbalah to the simple popular mysticism one finds in Hasidism. And that, I would suggest, is also a very astute point. Maharal lived, we said, from 1512, possibly as early as 1512 to 1609. His lifetime, therefore, spanned the transition from the, let's say, medieval era into the beginnings of modernity. I mean, 1609 is before. I mean, the modern era in Jewish history is associated normally with the French Revolution, which happened, of course, a long time later. But nevertheless, the Maharal foreshadows some of those changes. And as we see in this sentence, the esotericism of the Kabbalah to the simple popular mysticism one finds in Hasidic thought. And indeed, again, as we've mentioned, Maharal, I think, is one finds an echo of the writings of Maharal in many Hasidic works as well. So here's a nice example, and we'll end with this last example. This is Rabbi Yossi said, I'm going to read it from my page here, it's easier for me than reading on the screen. Rabbi Yossi said, great is the rite of circumcision, for it supersedes the important commandment prescribing cessation of work on the Sabbath. So Brit Milah overrides it's docha, that is to say, it takes precedence over the observance of Shabbos. To perform the act of circumcision in and of itself is a malacha which is forbidden on Shabbos. But because there is a mitzvah of circumcision on the 8th day, so one is allowed to, and it supersedes the mitzvah of Shabbos. Rabbi Shimon Konkos said, great is the rite of circumcision, for Moses was not granted 1 hour of grace when he neglected to circumcise his son. So this is another expression in Chazal of how great and how compelling or urgent is the mitzvah of Brit Milah. Even Moshe Rabbeinu, when he delayed for reasons which are a bit obscure, but Moshe was threatened with punishment. Tzipora had to quickly carry out the mitzvah of Brit Milah as the Torah relates. So Maharal says that this is a passage, Nedarim. Gemara in Nedarim says here at the bottom. Yeah, Nedarim. So Maharal says as follows: circumcision takes place on the 8th day, which is after the number 7, indicating the total transcendence of nature. 7 days symbolizes the natural cycle. 8 corresponds to that which transcends nature. So he says the circumcision takes us beyond nature, and it is for this reason that the 8th day, and that's on the 8th day, and it supersedes the Shabbos. Shabbos is the 7th day. Brit Milah is the 8th day. So 8, says Maharal, symbolically represents that which transcends or even extends beyond or is even more important than the 7th, and it can be more important than observance of Shabbos in the sense that it's the mitzvah of Milah is Doche Shabbos. But he goes further. Circumcision is a higher category than the Sabbath, for the Sabbath remains linked with the weekdays. Shabbos is the 7th day, which is like the coda on the 6 days of creation. Shabbos completes the 6 days, but it's connected to the 6 days. But circumcision, which comes after 7, has no link to the weekdays, because there are only 7 weekdays. After Shabbos, we go back to 1. We go to so Shabbos is the greatest of the days, but it's connected to the weekdays. But Brit Milah, the 8th day, transcends it. I know I may be losing you a bit, but it illustrates the sort of mystical language of the Maharal, which takes some training or some experience or some perseverance, if you're inclined to do so, to fully grasp it. Let's just read a few more sentences and then we're done. Similarly, the statement that Moshe was not given 1 hour's grace when he neglected to circumcise his son follows from the same principle that circumcision is above time. Time is a category of life in our world, which is differentiated into the 7 days of creation. As the text speaks of 1 day, the second day, until the completion of the 7 days. In other words, 7 represents the totality of time. After 7, we go back to 1 again. Time progresses in sets of 7, while circumcision is on the 8th day, which is above time. Moreover, as we have already explained, circumcision symbolizes the ideal form of man in the Platonic sense, as opposed to matter. That's surah, as opposed to chomer. And the ideal form is not subject to the relativities of time. So the writings of the Maharal have a kind of philosophical, mystical, almost an intent which is difficult to grasp. And some people find it inspiring. Some people can find it frustrating as well, I have to admit. When you read it, I speak for myself, I read a paragraph maybe a few times, I don't feel I really understand it yet. But then again, that kind of depth is also very appealing as well. And for someone who has an opportunity to study the writings of the Maharal, especially if he is introduced to them through a mentor, then the rewards are vast. It's just about 9:30. I want to thank everyone for listening to our discussion tonight and in the previous weeks as well. Just to remind you where we've been, we've done Don Isaac Abarbanel from Spain. We did Ovadia Seforno in Italy. We did Ramosha Al-Sheikh, who made his way to Tzfat. We did the Ari, who was born in Jerusalem, lived in Cairo, and the last years, only 2.5 years of his life, but the most famous years, he was in Tzfat again. And Maharao, we've ended back on the European continent with Maharao of Prague. So thank you again. I hope you've learned something from our series, and it has stimulated your thinking and made you curious to know more about the teachings of the writings and the legacy of these great Torah personalities. Then hopefully I will have contributed to that. And again, thank you for your cooperation and for joining us. If there are any questions or comments, we're happy to take them in the
Yes, I have to say I didn't know about the story of the rose that killed Maharal, because years ago I published a paper comparing a story of that kind about Moses in a book by Ella Kushalevsky that studied stories about the death of Moses. And something that happened in Naples in 1799, Horatio Nelson did something that in Italy is quite despised by putting down the Jacobin Republic in Naples. And there was even cannibalism. But something milder happened to the father when he was a young man of a famous intellectual. When they took him to prison, and he wasn't killed by the rest, somebody offered a rose, and he didn't know that it was in order to just stab him with a nail that was inside the rose.
Oh, I see. Interesting. Well, as I said, according to the legend, the Maharal's death was not quite as violent as that, although I suppose it amounts to the same thing. I mean, I'm not claiming that these legends are, factually accurate, but it contributes to our appreciation for the reverence and the love that the Czech people and the Lahavdil, I'm sure more so the Jewish people, had for his personality. And we've discovered tonight why. It wasn't only because of his intellectual virtuosity and his accomplishments, because he was a man of the people. He was a defender of the people. He spoke up on behalf of the common man. So maybe that's a nice note on which then I would just conclude maybe by saying that despite my initial comments about the Golem, who is to say for sure, maybe he did make the Golem after all. As we said, he had the ability to harmonize the spiritual and the rational, and anyone who can do that I'm sure can accomplish very great things in his lifetime and beyond. The fact that we're still recalling the Maharal as well as these other personalities, I think itself is testament to that.
Just wanted to say, over 100 years ago, somebody wrote a book about the Maharal that was inspired by Sherlock Holmes.
Yes, that's true. That is true. I forget which one it is. Yeah, one of the Sherlock Holmes stories. Yeah, if you Google it, I think
The purloined letter.
Yeah, thank you. The purloined letter. Yeah, it's inspired by the legend of the Golem. The Golem is, as I said, the evidence suggests that it was kind of popularized much more recently. Gershom Scholem calls it tendentious modern fiction. I wasn't going to tell you that, but now I have. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much.
One quick thing then before everyone drops, just to say on behalf of everyone to thank Rabbi Simon for tonight and for the whole series of fascinating portraits of some of these really important rabbinic sages and really bring their lives and their accomplishments to life for us. Just to note that all the recordings of this series will be available on their website and also on their Kesher website. And we very much look forward to welcoming Rabbi Simon back to Bnei Israel very soon. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you very much
you.
for the whole series. Thank you.
Thank you.